the 2025 NFL Draft is still a couple of months away. However, it's never too early to do a mock draft. So in today's video, let's go ahead and do another early 2025 NFL mock draft. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. Let's hop into it. And we are going to begin with the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is probably going to be the easiest pick of the entire draft, as long as they have the #1 pick. I think basically every single mock draft I do until we actually get to the draft will be with the same player, just because I don't think it should be, nor will be anybody else. I think it will be Travis Hunter inevitably. And then with the #2 overall pick, you have the Las Vegas Raiders. Again, this one kind of feels like it's already kind of set in stone. Again, we still have several months of, a couple more games left for Colorado and the college football landscape, as well as, of course, we still have an entire draft combine and offseason. So I think things could change, but at least right now with the #2 overall pick, I think Shedeur Sanders will be the #2 overall pick. So we have two Colorado, #1 and #2. And then at #3, we have the New York Giants. Last time I did a mock draft, I did not have them taking a quarterback, but that was because they were, I believe, like the 5th pick, and they could not get their hands on Cam Ward nor Shedeur Sanders. But given the fact they are in the 3rd overall pick, and given the fact that Cam Ward is on the board, I'm going to go with Cam Ward. When it comes to this year's quarterback class, I don't really know how many are going to go in the 1st round. Right now, I would say maybe at most 3, but more than likely probably just 2. And I think these two, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, are really the only ones that I think are realistic options to actually go in the top 5, and honestly in the 1st round in general. Then with the #4 overall pick, I think you have to add another weapon outside on the receiving core, tight end room, to help Drake May. The offensive line does need some work, but I think you can work and fix those issues in the free agency. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and take my #1 wide receiver prospect, and that is Tetairoa McMillan. He's long, lengthy, really good jump ball winner, can also do some things after the catch. I think he's a good receiver that's going to be a pretty safe pick for this Patriots team, and should be a top 15-ish level receiver for the inevitable future for the New England Patriots. And then at #5 for the Carolina Panthers, this one is interesting. I still think that you should take best prospect available in a position of need. If Tetairoa McMillan was on the board, I would like to see them add another weapon alongside what you already have in Xavier Legette. I will say I do think that Luther Burden is a fantastic fit for this team, given what they have on the outside already, but I am just going to go ahead and go with, in my opinion, the best defensive player in this year's draft, and that is going to be either Mason Graham or Abdul Carter. I think Mason Graham is a bit more of a refined product, but I think Abdul Carter is a bit more of a higher level prospect. So it's kind of depending on what you want to go for. Do you want to go with probably the more surefire guy, or the guy who might have a Hall of Fame type of career in Abdul Carter? One thing I will say about Mason Graham is this Carolina team already does have Derrick Brown, who is coming off an injury, so maybe you want to pair him alongside somebody who's younger, who can also develop. In this situation, I'm going to add an edge rusher in Abdul Carter. And then you have the New York Jets on the clock. Now, this could be a quarterback coming off the board here, but I just don't really think there's a quarterback that I really would want to take in this situation. You could take Jalen Milroe as like the ultimate project quarterback, somebody who you think can develop into becoming somebody, but I don't know, taking him at #6 is just really early for me. And then for Garrett Nussmeier, I like him as a prospect, but I don't think he's a 1st round quarterback, nor do I think Carson Beck or Quinn Ewers is either. So with that being said, I just kind of feel like I might go best player available on the offensive side of things, because the offense is still struggling. I'm thinking offensive lineman, but at #6 it still feels just a tad bit early. We could also go with Mason Graham to pair him alongside Quinnen Williams to add even more to that defensive line. I don't know. This is a really tough pick in this situation. Ultimately, though, I am probably just going to go with kind of a safe pick here. You have older tackles. Tyron Smith is probably going to retire within the next 2 to 3 years. You do have your young Olu Fashanu, so I think ideally you'd like to pair him with a left tackle of the future. Maybe you move Olu back to left tackle, and then you draft a right tackle. For in this situation, I'm just going to go with somebody who I think has a bunch of versatility, and that's going to be either Will Campbell or Kelvin Banks. I think Campbell is a bit more versatile, can probably more than likely will play at guard in the NFL level, whereas Kelvin Banks is a bit more of a traditional tackle, but I do think he could, if need be, play in the inside. So with that situation, I'm probably just going to take Kelvin Banks because I do think he's a better prospect. Next up, we have the Tennessee Titans. Again, quarterback could be in play here, but I am not going to go with quarterback. I think the defense for the most part is pretty good, so I just feel like you want to add something on the outside alongside what you already have in Calvin Ridley. Will Levis has played well enough these past couple weeks. Do I think he's the long-term answer at quarterback? I think that's still to be determined, but I do think you want to give him the best opportunity to do so. Again, you have Calvin Ridley, but outside of him, there isn't really a bunch of big name guys that I'm a big fan of, although there are some guys who are playing pretty damn well. Right now, my eyes are on Luther Burden, but I could also even see taking a tackle. The past 2 years, you've taken a bunch of offensive linemen, and sure, your head coach is a offensive lineman-oriented guy, so maybe you would be more inclined to take a guy like a Will Campbell, who's still on the board. But in this situation, I really do think Luther Burden would pair quite nicely alongside Calvin Ridley, so I am going to go with Luther Burden. And then you have the Cleveland Browns. This offensive line is going to be really interesting moving forward. They have not played very well, but they've also been extremely injured these past couple years. Could you hypothetically go quarterback in this situation? Yes, 1000%, but I just don't think that's what's going to happen here. You could even potentially add a guy like a Malachi Starks, although I think your secondary is already pretty stout. In this situation, I think your offensive line is diminishing, it's getting older, as well as more injury prone. Getting a guy like Will Campbell, who has versatility to play tackle and guard, could be a nice pickup. But next up at number 9, you have the Cincinnati Bengals. The defensive line needs a lot of work. I know you're potentially losing T. Higgins, but you're also potentially losing Trey Hendrickson. Whether you keep Trey Hendrickson and BJ Hill or not, I do think Mason Graham should be the pick here if he is somehow available. I don't think he will be available with pick number 9, but if he hypothetically is, I think you take him and you have no remorse about taking him because he's going to be a really good player. Next up at number 10, you have the New Orleans Saints. It's kind of interesting because you just don't really know what this team is going to look like in the offseason. Could they have, a brand new head coach, or will it be the interim head coach? Are they going to have Derek Carr? Are they not going to have Derek Carr? A lot of questions to be answered, but in this situation, there's a couple of really good players on the board here. You could go Will Johnson, but I don't really love the idea when you took Kool-Aid last year and you still have a pretty solid secondary for the most part. You could also take Nick Scourton, who could play both inside and outside on the defensive line. That could be a bit of a need, but I feel like you need a bit more of a refined pass rusher. I think Jalen Walker is extremely interesting because he's sort of a do-it-all linebacker, hybrid edge rusher as well. He could be a fun pickup to add to your defense. You could also even go offensive lineman by taking somebody like a Josh Simmons or an Ursary or a Wyatt Milam. Not really feeling those picks that much because you did take a tackle last year. Will Johnson is kind of speaking to me. If you could pair him alongside what you already have, that would be pretty damn nice, but I think I am ultimately just going to go with a edge rusher who also has versatility as an interior and exterior guy, so I'm going to go with Nick Scourton from Texas A&M. I think this is a little bit high on him, but I think he's going to perform very well at the draft combine. He's a big individual who's really athletic. I do think he'd be a good player, but I don't necessarily think it would be a home run hit for a top 10 pick. Hey y'all, real quick, I just want to interrupt this video to let you guys know that I have a brand new YouTube channel called Metro Stories. It is simply going to be focused on NFL stories, whether it's on players and teams. I think you guys might like it, so go ahead and check it out. The link will be in the description below as well as in the pinned comment. I think you guys might like it. Let's get back to the video though. Next up, Chicago, you have got to fix the offensive line. It's one of the worst offensive line units out there, though lately it hasn't been terrible, but there's a bunch of injuries and inconsistent play. I think you probably want to find either a tackle or a guard. Of the guys available, Cameron Williams probably has the least amount of questions. Josh Simmons is injured right now, so we're not sure how he's going to look this offseason. Wyatt Milam's a really good player, but I just think Cameron Williams is a bit younger and a bit more of a, maybe not refined prospect, but has maybe a bit of a higher ceiling. You could also go Ursary, who's just an absolute mammoth of a guard or tackle. This is a really interesting one. I am probably going to go ahead and take Cameron Williams because I do think he has the highest upside to be potentially a really awesome tackle or guard. Right now, he's playing right tackle for Texas, which I don't think he will play for the Chicago Bears. I think in this situation, you're either going to move him out to left tackle to replace what you have there, or move him into the interior. Either way, I think he's a really good prospect who has a really high upside ceiling. Next up, the Miami Dolphins. I think in this situation, the Will Johnson fall probably has to end. Their secondary isn't particularly bad per se, but given the fact that Ramsey is getting older and given the fact that there's other positions you might need to look to address, Will Johnson is arguably the best player on the board, so I think you might end up taking him, especially given the fact that I'm just not really in love with any of these offensive linemen on the board still. So in that situation, I think the fall for Will Johnson will end and he'll be a Miami Dolphin. Then you have the Dallas Cowboys, and I think in this situation, the Dallas Cowboys would be absolutely ecstatic. Number one, you have probably your number one prospect in Ashton Jeanty, but you also have guys like Malachi Starks who could be a perfect fit for this Cowboys team, not to mention Jalen Walker and 3 offensive lineman prospects that I think Dallas will like. But given the fact that Dallas's ground game is absolutely atrocious, although it has been getting better lately, I do think Ashton Jeanty would and should be the pick. Next up, San Francisco, all the way up at pick number 14, which is just, it's really crazy to see. And they actually are not in a bad situation to get a really talented player. Getting a guy like Malachi Starks to add into that defense could be pretty darn nice. I know safety isn't the biggest need, but in this situation, do you just go best available prospect and let him flourish on your defense? Again, you have bigger needs, for example, like wide receiver and offensive lineman, but at the same time, Malachi Starks is a fantastic prospect that should be a top 10 pick, but given the fact that he's a safety, he probably likely won't go top 10. I will say there's some other names on here like Emeka Egbuka, who's also calling my name, as well as Isaiah Bond, who would actually pair quite nicely alongside what you already have in Brandon Ayuk. But I think I am kind of falling in love with the idea of just taking the best available prospect in Malachi Starks, who can play free safety, strong safety, even I think he could honestly play inside the box sometimes. I'm going to go with Malachi Starks. Again, probably not the biggest need, but I think you can make it work because I think he is by far the best talent still on the board. I think in that situation, the Indianapolis Colts would be pretty darn pissed because they'd probably love to have him in this situation because he's no longer on the board. There is a couple of really nice names that I really do like. Jalen Walker is really speaking out to me as just a dominant edge, as well as a dominant linebacker who's a fantastic blitzer. Colston Loveland from Michigan is also speaking to me quite nicely, as well as Tyler Warren from Penn State. All of those prospects could be key pieces to add to this team. This is a tough one. Ultimately, I think you just want to continue to build what you're building on the offensive side of things, and I guess the question comes down to who do you prefer? Do you prefer Tyler Warren, who I think is playing currently better than Colston Loveland, or do you prefer the receiving upside of a guy like Colston Loveland? In this situation, I'm going to go with Tyler Warren, though. He's a bit of a, I believe, a bigger body, 6'6", 261, a senior, is having a really good, fantastic year, almost 1,000 yards on over 100 targets, really solid player, really good tight end, a big 6'6". That's absolutely massive. I think he could be a standout pick, especially because this is a draft that isn't really loaded. Drafting a tight end in the first round makes actually a bunch of sense. Next up, Tampa Bay. This is the Jalen Walker pick. He is an absolute freak. You play him at linebacker, you play him at edge, just let him be an explosive athlete. I think he'd be a fantastic and almost damn near a perfect pick for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Next up, the LA Rams. I think this one has to be offensive lineman. Your team is getting a little bit older, but I still do think Stafford will play at least one more year with this team. So if that is the case, I think you do need to kind of shore up your offensive line. Given the fact that I don't think your window is terribly long, I don't like the idea of taking Josh Simmons because he's probably maybe not going to be ready for the start of the season next year, if not at all. So because of that, I'm going to take probably the best available offensive lineman still on the board, and that might just be Wyatt Milam. 6'6", 317 pounds, hasn't given up a sack this year. I guess I'll go with Wyatt Milam. I don't love taking West Virginia players, but I guess we'll take it. Next up, the Arizona Cardinals are on the clock here, and I think this is a situation where you just go best available defensive lineman, whether that is Mykel Williams, who's having a pretty good year, Shamar Stewart, or Kenneth Grant. I think all three of these guys will likely be in the running for the Cardinals pick here. In this situation, I do value the interior of the defensive line a tad bit more than the edge rushing room. So with that said, I am going to go ahead and take Kenneth Grant to be on the Arizona Cardinals. I think he'd be a nice plug-and-play player who's going to be an immediate starter and an immediate impact player. Next up, the Atlanta Falcons. This honestly worked out quite nicely because they also need an edge rusher. I think Mykel Williams is the pick here. He's a better edge, in my opinion, than Shamar Stewart. I like Mykel Williams' game a lot. He's a really good pass rusher, just needs to kind of refine his craft a tad bit. I also think he does provide decent versatility to play either side of the right side, left side, even sometimes in the inside. So I'm going to go with Mykel Williams because I think he'd be a really solid fit for the Falcons. Then moving on, you have the Seattle Seahawks. I do think offensive lineman is definitely on the board. This could be a spot for Josh Simmons because maybe you're more inclined to give him time to develop. Ariante Ursary, though, also speaks to me. I mean, he is an absolute mammoth of a player. You could go linebacker here too, but there's not really a linebacker prospect that I'm terribly high on. Jahad Campbell is who they say is the next best linebacker. I just don't know if you take him this early, and given the names here, yeah, you're probably not taking linebacker here. I'm gonna go with Ursary. He's just a really big player who I think is likely going to be moving into the inside of the offensive line, just given how big and girthy he is. I'm gonna go with Ursary. Then next up, you have the Washington Commanders. I think you want to ideally build your offense to become a really dominant unit alongside Jaden Daniels. I will say there are a couple of defensive players that do speak to my liking. Benjamin Morrison unfortunately has a major injury, and I think it could potentially move him out of the first round, which is very unfortunate. Colston Loveland would also be a nice fit here for the Washington Commanders. Maybe not their biggest need, but if you want to add a weapon for Jaden Daniels, that could be pretty damn nice. Isaiah Bond, Shamar Stewart, these are some really good names here. I even like the idea of adding a James Pierce Jr., who at one point was a top 5 pick prospect, but has kind of fallen down the draft board a little bit. In this situation, they could really use an edge rusher. Right now, they're starting Dorrance Armstrong Armstrong and Dante Fowler and a couple other guys. So maybe you want to have a bit more of a refined pass rusher. And I think of the guys on the board, James Pierce Jr. is probably the best pass rusher. So I'm going to go ahead and give them a pass rusher in James Pierce. And then moving on to the Houston Texans, the offensive line has got to be a position to address. Unfortunately, though, Josh Simmons is the only, really, in my opinion, first-round caliber offensive lineman still on the board. And number one, I don't really know if he moves as greatly to guard as he would in tackle. And he's coming off an injury. This is a Texans team that needs an immediate impact player. And I just don't know if he's going to be an immediate impact guy. So because of that, that's kind of puts them in a really tough spot here. I think ideally maybe they would trade up a couple picks before to maybe pick up a guy like Ursary, but I think, you know, there is an Ohio State connection between him and CJ Stroud, so maybe you're willing to try to find a tackle prospect who may not be able to play a chunk of next year, but could be the future tackle for CJ Stroud for the foreseeable future. I think Josh Simmons is a good player, just coming off an injury, so we'll kind of have to wait and see if he does play next year, but given the fact this isn't a great draft, I think Josh Simmons would be a really solid player for the Texans. Next up, Denver Broncos. I think this has to be a weapon for Bo Nix. Colston Loveland is really speaking my name, as well as Isaiah Bond. Basically every single mock draft that I've done personally or on this channel, I consistently have them taking Colston Loveland because I think he's just a really solid fit. But in this situation with Isaiah Bond on the board here, I'm going to switch it up a tad bit. I'm going to go with Isaiah Bond to play alongside Courtland Sutton. I also do think Emeka Egbuka is also a really good name. In fact, to be honest with you, I didn't even see him. I think I am going to take Emeka here. He's actually probably a better fit alongside what you have already in Courtland Sutton, so I am going to go ahead and actually take Emeka Egbuka. And then there's the Baltimore Ravens. This one, in my opinion, has got to be a cornerback. Again, I talked about Benjamin Morrison earlier. I think the injury is really serious. I think it's a hip injury, I want to say, and that is a massive injury for especially a cornerback, especially if you're going to take him in the first round. Now, of the names on the board here, I think Jahdae Barron is the best coverage guy. He's a Thorpe Award finalist. I think he's likely going to win the award, but there's some other names too on here, like Trey Amos from Ole Miss and Siobhan Revel. Siobhan Revel, I believe, is 6'3", so he's really well sized, but is playing for East Carolina, so that's not the greatest competition. If you're Baltimore, I think your window to win is right now, so I think you just got to go with a guy who can come in there and instantly make an impact. I'm a lot higher on Jahdae Barron than a lot of other people are, a lot of other analysts. I think Jahdae Barron is a lock to be a first-round pick, but I see a lot of mock drafts keeping him out, which is unfortunate because I think he is a good player. I think the thing that holds him back is that he's not incredibly well-sized at 5'11", 200 pounds. He's also not necessarily a gifted athlete, but I think his versatility as a safety, corner, or nickel is just so, honestly, priceless. So in this situation, if I was in the draft room, I would take Jahdae Barron. But given the fact that I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick, maybe you go with a bit of a higher upside guy like a Trey Amos, who's a really good player in his own right, or even somebody like a Siobhan Revel, who again is a massive individual. It just kind of sucks that he's from East Carolina. But in this situation, it's my mock draft. I'm going to take Jahdae Barron. I'm a huge fan of his game, and I think his versatility would be perfect for that Ravens defense. And then next up, the LA Chargers. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh, Michigan guy. They need to add weapons on the offense. Colston Loveland is on the board here. That would make a bunch of sense. But you could maybe prioritize an outside receiver. I don't necessarily love the fit of Isaiah Bond in the LA Chargers offense just because you already have Ladd McConkey, who's an undersized kind of slot slash outside guy. And then you have Quentin Johnston, who's kind of a burner. Don't really love the idea of Isaiah Bond. I think I'm just going to go ahead and take Colston Loveland. I think he'd be a perfect fit, and he gets to reconnect with his old coach. Then there's the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I think this is where Isaiah Bond goes. I think I've heard some people not necessarily love the pick of Isaiah Bond going to Pittsburgh, and I kind of completely disagree. Yes, he's undersized, and yes, he hasn't necessarily been as productive with Texas as maybe you would want him to be, but I think that's less because of him and more to do with just injuries and also kind of some inconsistent play from his quarterback in Quinn Ewers. If you've actually watched the game, there have been multiple times where Isaiah Bond has gotten great separation and has gotten big plays waiting to happen, but Quinn Ewers isn't necessarily the most consistent player as well as the most accurate quarterback. You put Isaiah Bond in an offense with George Pickens and the Michigan guy, I can't remember his name. I think he's more of a slot receiver. It's absolutely just leaving my name. But you put him alongside those guys, I think he'd be a fantastic fit. He's probably going to run like a 4-3 flat, 4-2 something. I mean, he's an absolute burner. You put him alongside George Pickens with Russell Wilson, it's going to be a whole lot of chunk plays. Next up, you have the Green Bay Packers. I think offensive lineman is on the board here, as well as potentially cornerback. I will say of the team so far, this is maybe the best spot for a guy like Benjamin Moore Morrison to go to. That injury is scary, but a team like Green Bay could be willing to give him some time to, get back from this injury and eventually come in and be a full-time starter for them. But at the same time, there's a couple interior defensive linemen like Walter Nolan, who I do think will be a first-round pick, who would also be a really nice fit for this defensive line. Offensive line-wise, there really isn't anyone who I'm a big fan of. So for me, this pick kind of comes down to Walter Nolan and Benjamin Morrison. The higher talent, in my opinion, is Benjamin Morrison, but I do think that a more impact player immediately would be Walter Nolan because he's, of course, healthy. This is a tough one. I'm 50-50 on this one. You flip a coin, I'm okay with it. In this situation, though, I'm just going to go ahead and take Walter Nolan. And then next up, you have the Minnesota Vikings. Running back is a bit of a need with them, with Aaron Jones probably not coming back to this team next year. You could go again with Benjamin Morrison to add to that secondary, but I think the defense is already pretty damn good, and you have a guy in Amari Hampton who is a freaking stud. So you also have Caleb Johnson, who's also a stud as well. In this situation, I think running back wouldn't be a bad pick for pick 28. I'm going to go ahead and take Amari Hampton. Then moving on, you have the Philadelphia Eagles. Their secondary is already pretty damn good. They could say, screw it, let's add another young cornerback to make our secondary just that much more deadly. Hypothetically, if you were to draft a Benjamin Morrison, you're probably going to end up moving Cooper DeJean to safety, but don't really think you need to do that all that much because you just don't need to. In this situation, there's not a bunch of names that I'm a huge fan of. I think Shamar Stewart could end up being the pick here. 6'6", 290, has really good versatility to play on the outside or on the inside. I will say, I wasn't a big fan of his game against Texas. He kind of got bullied out there. In fact, that entire defensive line got bullied out there by Texas, so that does kind of concern me. But given the draft pick situation here, I don't really feel like there's a bunch of other guys who I would rather have over Shamar Stewart. Could you convince me for a guy like a Princely or a Landon Jackson, which, by the way, I think Landon Jackson just had a massive injury, so I hope he's okay. LT Overton is also a potential name. TJ Sanders is also a really good player. Could go Tyleik Williams, but I don't think an interior defensive lineman is that big of a need. And again, the linebacking class isn't particularly good either, so I think I'm just going to go ahead and take Shamar Stewart. Big versatility, SEC guy. Again, I didn't love his game against Texas, but he's a good player. Then moving on, you have the Buffalo Bills. This Bills team is just really loaded with a bunch of really good players. I think there's two players that I think I'm going to pick here between Tyleik Williams from Ohio State, who's a really good interior defensive lineman, or Benjamin Morrison, who again is coming off an injury, but could be a really good piece down the line for this Buffalo Bills team. Cornerback isn't necessarily their biggest need, but at the same time, if you can find a potential upgrade late in the first round, I think you would do so. This is a Bills team that could give this guy plenty of time to get healthy and maybe come back for 2026, or maybe come back for a late playoff push next year. Again, Tyleik Williams is probably the more responsible pick here because I think he's a really solid player. But Benjamin Morrison, if he was healthy, would be like a top 15 pick. And you're at pick number 30. Again, it's not your biggest need in the world. You do have a bunch of really good outside corners, but I think Benjamin Morrison is an awesome talent. I think you just end up taking the talent here. So I'm going to go with Benjamin Morrison. Next up, you have the Kansas City Chiefs. In this situation, if a tight end was available on the board, I would definitely consider taking him to be an understudy for Travis Kelce's the last couple years, but unfortunately there isn't one. It does say running back is a need, but I think as long as you have Isaiah Pacheco, you're more than likely just going to keep him. I will say, if you could pair a running back such as like a Quinshon Judkins, who's a bit more of a home run hitter, to pair him alongside what you have in Isaiah Pacheco, that could be pretty damn nice. But I just don't think it's that big of a need. Honestly, this team is just really solid. There's not a bunch of names that I'm a huge fan of here. Could you go wide receiver? Maybe, but I just don't know who's really a first round option. I like Trey Harris. I think he's a first round option. Kyron Lacy is also an interesting player, but I just don't think he's a really good culture fit for that Chiefs team, whereas I do think Trey Harris could be. Trey Harris kind of reminds me of like how DK Metcalf was, where he's just absolutely stand out. Maybe doesn't have the greatest stats in the world, but is just a really good player who kind of falls a tad bit. I know wide receiver isn't their biggest need, but they could use somebody on the outside. Obviously, you're going to get back Rashee Rice. You do have DeAndre Hopkins right now, but how long is he going to be DeAndre Hopkins for? I'm going to take Trey Harris. I think he's really, of the guys left, the only first round caliber guy that I would personally take in my personal opinion. And then lastly, you have the Detroit Lions. Interior offensive line could definitely be the pick here because you are potentially going to be losing a couple guys in free agency. But at the same time, you're coming off a year where Aiden Hutchinson had a pretty bad leg injury, and you already don't have a bunch of great depth there. So in this situation, I think I'm probably going to take Princely, who I think is maybe the best project player to take a draft pick on. 11 sacks this year, 7 sacks last year, 6 sacks in 2022. Again, not a refined product by any means, but if you do get him going, he can be a really good player. And I think given the fact that this Lions team is already so stout on offense, you're probably just going to take best player, at least best project player available, and I think Princely could be one of those options. So as you can see, this is my mock draft right here. Let me know in the comment section below if you guys disagreed with any of the picks. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. We're really close to 10,000 subscribers, so it would mean a lot to me if you did subscribe. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I love you guys. Peace.